All right. Do you hear me fine? Perfect. I remember from one of my first experience developing a front-end application. I was very new to web development. We were put on a pretty important project for the company I was working for at the time. And inexperienced as I was, they asked if someone knew JavaScript or wanted to learn JavaScript. Yep. Did I know anything about JavaScript? Not really that much at the time. But we went all in, and we decided to use the up-and-coming technologies at the time. So the technologies we ended up using were ASP.NET MVC, is a Microsoft technology for the backend and web framework, and a web technology called jQuery. So this is back in 2009, 2010, and so does anyone here actually use jQuery before? Yeah, a lot of hands. How has the code been when writing jQuery? Has it been elegant and pretty, or is it like, yeah? So again, combination, young in the game, learning jQuery, didn't know much about the web, spaghetti code. So that's kind of my first experience writing code for the web. It was a mess, and I worked at this company, so I had to deal with that mess. I wish I knew a little more about structuring my code, structuring the way I put files, and reason about how files can help us think about code. And yeah, that's what we're going to talk about a bit about today. So hi, I'm Pav. You can find me on social on Pav Saund. I have around 15-ish years experience as a developer. I've had many roles, both on a tech side, but also on a more managerial side. I find myself as a developer at a company called Davidhorn these days. I'm wearing all my hats. So there's a bit of product hat on, there's a bit of developer hat on, and yeah, working on all the things. So scaling component architecture is one of the things which are in the title of this talk, and these are words which have many meanings, so I thought I'll break it down for this context. So what I'm going to be talking about is, or the definition as is here is, how the architecture of an application allows your code base to scale with the expanding needs of the application itself, but also team. So specifically, we're going to be talking about a couple of things, or three things here. The focus is going to be on the application structure, but I'll also be touching on how that structure will help scale the application itself and teams. And a kind of bonus at the end is looking at routes as a way to help us there. So I'm going to be talking about three distinct ways of structuring things. There are many different ways to do this, but I've come up with my own terms, and you may recognize them. So I'll be talking about something called a flat structure. The arrows I'll get back to. It's a more technical focused structure. And then something I've coined, in this talk at least, a feature structure. So, is this readable? Okay. So this what we're seeing here is something I think is, well, this is something a lot of developers meet very early in their career. It's a very flat structure. This example itself is just using, is based on React and TypeScript. Important distinction. No, so it's a very common structure which people meet very early in the career. It's very easy to reason about. It's easy to get started, And what you see as kind of the core essence here is that all your components and files are living in one space, one folder. It could be the root folder, it could be a folder like this called components. I think this is a very common pattern. It's really simple to get started with, like I mentioned. And it's also so common that any new developer will meet this at every single tutorial they'll see. So every tutorial will have a very simple structure because they don't want people to focus on the structure. But it does become cluttered over time. As you see here, there are many components with different responsibilities, and they're all grouped in the same space. And it's really hard to reason about the importance of what a component is. So because they're in the same physical structure, it's hard to reason that the card component is probably less important than the records detail page in this example. And touching on scale, and this doesn't scale. One developer can churn out something really fast with this structure. Two developers are going to be stepping on each other's toes. But it's really practical for those one-offs, for those testing purposes. And this looks really clean compared to the code I was referring to in my jQuery example. So, yeah. So moving on. There we go. This, I think, is a something which I think more people will recognize, like from their day-to-day. It's a more technical-based structure, and what that means. The principle behind this is more the technical cohesion, as it's here. So cohesion, in this sense, is how we group things, how we put things together. And in this sense, you're saying that now we've introduced many other folders in the hierarchy. There's so components folder has become a little smaller, but we've introduced things like constants, models, pages. You may have other things, utilities. And we're basically looking at our code from a developer's lens, right? How do we developers make sense of the code writing? So we're putting things in, grouping things by what they are, not what they're doing. So this scales actually pretty well. So it does support more complex application structures. You can imagine that once you start with these folder structures, then you can use them quite efficiently. It becomes a lot easier to navigate the artifacts of your application. When I say artifact, I mean the different, basically, the artifacts is how we're grouping things. But it has some challenges. Still, it's still hard to reason the importance of what you're looking at. It's still a flat structure. It's hard to reason about where should I be looking as a developer to understand where to make a change in code. And it's also easy to misuse components. Now, what I mean by misusing components is that because we don't have this visual hierarchy about importance, it's hard to know like which component do I reach out to. There could be duplication involved. There could be a semi-generic component introduced by a specific feature, and then another feature comes along and says, "Oh, I want to use that," and that kind of messes up things. So as you see from the arrows here, that we're kind of reaching across the whole directory structure to pull on dependencies. What this kind of leads to is then this cognitive overload. So as a developer, then I want to create a component. I have some supporting types, some models, artifacts, things like that. And now I have to place these in different places in the code base. It's quite fine. It works for many people, but it adds that extra level of an extra layer to go through. So this is just back of the jQuery, the example. This is how the ASP.NET MVC stack is set up by default. And it is useful. But I find this scales to a certain point, but you're not getting the full benefit of where this can go. So moving over to something I like to call the feature structure, and talking about looking at this, the principle behind this, basically domain cohesion. Now, with domain cohesion, I'm not talking about the domain as a website. I'm talking about the problem domain of the application. So what is the problem you're trying to solve with this application? So instead of technical groupings, we have high cohesion, meaning we group things together around a feature. And the feature should be talking about something around the domain. So looking at the change which has gone on, if you focus on the orange box in this one, this example, we're seeing that the feature called home has now, well, firstly, we've introduced the features folder to separate out generic components and then features as something more organic, something close to the application. And the orange example of home, you see we're pulling in all the relevant files to that home component. So we're no longer spreading files all over the solution. So we're taking the technical concerns and saying, there may be technical concerns, the different responsibilities, or they represent different artifacts. But from the view of the home feature, they're all grouped together. Now, this makes reasoning and working around a feature a lot easier, in my experience. It means that when I'm in the home feature, that's where my code is going to be changing. I don't have to navigate across the whole application. And it's easier then to bring the domain language, the actual application, the need you're trying to solve with the application. It's easier than to bring that into the code. So there's a certain set of like regular features a website has, more like home and profile in this example. But then you see there's a records feature at the very bottom here, the blue box. In this case, it could be records for like albums and music. It could also be patient journal records. But it's talking about something which exists in the domain of the user, which is using your application. So when you do that and you start grouping things together, you then start to bring more and more of that language into the code base. I also feel this helps with importance. It helps with reasoning about where my eyes need to go to find the features which are important to me. And it actually becomes slightly harder to misuse components. But so basically, because you're living in this one folder, and you're building out your feature, what happens is then when you need a supporting UI component, you introduce that within this feature. You don't automatically think, okay, I need to introduce a UI component. I'm going to put it in the components folder. That's a generic dumping ground, if you will. So in a way, it introduces a bit more duplication. So you may have similar components spread across multiple features, but you're then given the opportunity to actually adjust those components and only at a later time pull them out into something shared. So it's giving developers another tool to build up speed. And one thing which I haven't written about here is that, or shown here, is that a feature grouping is not one level. A feature grouping can be many levels of sub-features as well. So whenever you're talking about, in this instance, the records feature, you're also going to be talking about the records detail page. You're going to be talking about everything related to that. And as you see from these arrows and the direction they're pointing, they're kind of pointing in one direction. And that, again, that's about how the dependencies are structured within these components. Our developers then able to kind of focus on this one dependency tree, and that makes the overhead a lot easier, or a lot less, basically. So as a kind of bonus to this feature structure, this is something I've had a lot of joy using in the applications I've built, and that's bringing the routes, basically the URLs of the application straight into your structure. I know this may not necessarily jive with everyone, but what I've found is that by talking about the routes as part of the structure, you're building up the same mental model in your code base as you are with the users, what the users are experiencing in the URL, in the application. So that mental model is very a lot easier for that developer to understand where they are in the application compared to where the user is, or where the feature is being built. It also becomes a lot easier to reason about state. This actually should have been the previous slide, but it plays well here as well. It's easier to reason about state because when you're in a component tree, it's then easier to understand that because it's hierarchical, because there is a dependency order here. When you have state on one level, it's then easier to understand this is now available to all these sub-components. That's not necessarily true when the state is decoupled completely and you're pulling on it from different places. So I find this is and it becomes a lot easier to reason about what is the information I have available in my component at this time. And as you see here, just as an example for profile here, we've now introduced two folders called backup security. They're single component components basically. But instead of introducing them on the level of profile, we're introducing them in separate subfolders, and that's also representing the different hierarchy. I find that this approach it helps with onboarding of new developers. It helps when just reasoning about why is this nested so deep? Why is it not nested deep? It just gives another layer of another helper as we're reasoning around our code. And one thing I've found really useful, especially when starting a new feature or maybe a brand new project, is by going, leaning on routes to begin with. It actually helps with many UX discussions. So when you're speaking with a user experience designer or someone else who's responsible from the product perspective, by forcing things into routes, you're getting quite a bit of nice discussions for free. It's quite often you start with a prototype. You start with here, make the screen, but where's that screen going to live? How does the user get to a screen? What are the states to get to the screen? Is there a loading state? Is there not? Right? You kind of force these discussions quite a lot sooner. I feel. I guess one of the major drawbacks, or a drawback, is that it's a more nested structure. You have to navigate a bit more to kind of get to where you want to be. But I don't really see that as a drawback. I see that as a strength because it talks to the power of using those nested routes and having that one-to-one match with the URLs. I guess probably the biggest negative side of this is if you ever do decide to change URL, you need to move folders. So you have to rename folders, move things around. Yeah, but that's there. So just wrapping this up, we've gone through a few different types of structures, things you're familiar with, and hopefully something new. We've talked about using a features-first approach to bring the domain into your code base and help you scale both your team and application. And using routes as a way to kind of give you a little booster there as well. And finally, these are just patterns. These are simple examples. You've seen that. And there are many variants to how this can go. There are different ways to then structure this on a bigger level. And kind of back to the initial, what you said also, Ruth, you need to care for the structures, because all these structures will become messy if you don't care for them. So hopefully you can take something from this with you and use it in your day-to-day. Thank you so much.